Good afternoon. My name is David Holmes. I'm the head of product for Amazon GameLift. Amazon GameLift is a managed AWS service to help game developers specifically manage dedicated servers for their games. I'm going to talk about three things today. I'm going to give an overview of Amazon GameLift. I'm going to talk about our two key value propositions, which are auto-scaling specifically tailored to games, and something that we call Matchmaking Cues, which is a portion of the matchmaking process to make it easier for your games to be able to balance player experience with cost. And finally, I'll talk about some of the future directions we're going to take the service. Before I go any further, though, let me introduce myself a little bit more. I've been in the games industry 15 years. I was an executive producer at Microsoft in publishing, so working with external game developers to help them make great games. I was executive producer for Gears of War 3 with Epic. And while at Amazon, I released 5 mobile games, all partnering with external game developers. So my passion is helping game developers like yourselves make great games. And the interesting thing about Amazon GameLift is, it's a service that we're building to allow you to spend more time making excellent games and provide you with a back-end infrastructure to be able to deliver great experiences to your customers. So building a service to manage dedicated servers is difficult. There are many trade-offs that you have to decide upon when you're building a service like GameLift. You have to think about being able to scale to how successful your game becomes, and hopefully your game becomes very successful. You have to make sure the service is reliable. You have to make sure it's secure so that hackers and other people that want to do malicious things to your users aren't able to do that. It has to be affordable to you, so you need to be able to balance cost of the back-end infrastructure with a great player experience for your players. And it has to be operationally manageable. So you don't want to be spending a great deal of money or manpower on running your back-end service. You'd most likely want to spend that money to continue to make your game great and continue to acquire more players. And so we've been trying to build a service that accomplishes all these things that you can rely upon so you can spend your time and focus on making better games. So this diagram is an attempt to illustrate how Amazon GameLift is typically integrated into a game. You can see down here, so this is the game client. So if you have a mobile game, that's a phone or a tablet. And up here are your game servers, right? So you would build your game client, you would build your game servers, and then Amazon GameLift is the purple component there. Amazon GameLift integrates with your game server and integrates with a back-end service that you would build. In this case, on the diagram, is a matchmaking service. And so there's 2 points of integration between Amazon GameLift and your game client and your game server. So first, I want to talk about auto-scaling and GameLift's specific implementation of auto-scaling. GameLift is built upon Amazon EC2, and Amazon EC2 has auto-scaling, for those of you that are familiar with it. What we've done with Amazon GameLift is we've built upon that proven AWS infrastructure to create a version of auto-scaling that's specific for games, that uses metrics like available game sessions, available player slots to do the scaling, rather than the typical AWS metrics of CPU usage or memory. What we found is that a typical multiplayer game, if you thought about having a fixed number of servers during a day, actually only needs about 50% of those servers as the users come and go over the day. And so if you used a fixed number of servers and didn't scale them up and scale them down based on player need, you would be using your servers only about half the time. So you'd be paying for all these server hours, but not actually using them all. And so our auto-scaling feature allows you to scale up and scale down the number of servers, again, based on more gamer-specific metrics to make that a more intelligent scaling up and scaling down operation. This is a graph that we put together using Steam data of over a 24-hour period, the number of players that are engaged in playing a typical Steam game. As you can see, and not surprising, in the early morning you have the fewest number of players. At lunch you have a small peak, and then in the evening you have the most players. And so what you would want is you would want your servers to match this curve, or whatever is the curve for your particular game. So you'd want to have the fewest number of servers active in the morning to match that player demand. And you'd want it to change over the course of the day, or the week, or the month to match your player engagement. So you want to pay the least amount of money, but you want to have as many servers available as your players need. The first step in integrating Amazon GameLift is to integrate our server SDK with your game server. The GameLift server SDK is available in C++ and C#, so you can use it with Amazon Lumberyard, the Unreal Engine, the Unity engine, and really any engine, be it even a custom engine, developed in C++ or C#. Now, we've built an Unreal plugin to simplify integration of Amazon GameLift into Unreal games. As far as a server operating system goes, we support Windows, Server 2012, and Amazon Linux. So if you're a Windows shop, we support Windows. If you're a Linux developer, we support that as well. And then maybe not surprisingly, there's built-in support for Amazon GameLift and Lumberyard. And so if you use Lumberyard to build your game, it's even that much easier to integrate GameLift and to utilize GameLift with your game. So I'm going to walk through really briefly at a sort of a high level how you add GameLift to your game. So the first thing you do is you build your game server in whatever engine and whatever language you want. And then you upload that game server build into the Amazon GameLift system. You can do that through our AWS console, through command line interface, or if you wanted to use the GameLift API, you could build that right into any kind of component you'd want to create to do that. You upload that same game server build in whatever region around the world that Amazon GameLift supports that you want to be running your game servers in. What we do is we then create a fleet, which is like a container of game server instances, in each of the regions that you've uploaded that build. Back. There we go. So then what you do is for each of the fleets, you define a set of auto-scaling rules. And like I mentioned before, the auto-scaling rules scale the number of servers up and down based on metrics that are more relevant to games. Number of server instances, number of players, number of matches that are waiting to be placed, all things that impact the player experience, you can choose to use to scale the number of servers up and down. There we go. Having trouble here. And this is just an indicator of how that works. So you can see there's some instances that are completely full of games. And so a single GameLift instance can contain one or more game servers. And so you can actually use a single Amazon GameLift instance and contain multiple games at one time. And so obviously we won't add a new server instance until prior server instances are completely full of active games. One of the things that we definitely encourage people to do is, as you've released your game and auto-scaling rules are scaling the number of servers up and down, is you're going to want to adjust them over time, right? Because you won't get them 100% correct right from game launch. You'll see how your players are behaving. You'll see how those servers are scaling up and down. And so in our console, we provide a great deal of metrics around how the service is performing and how your game instances are performing so that you can take that data and then adjust the auto-scaling rules to provide a better player experience, to balance maybe cost more compared to that player experience. Really, the power is in your hands to tweak the auto-scaling rules in any way that makes sense for your game or your business. Okay, so that's auto-scaling. We believe auto-scaling is one of the key value propositions of Amazon GameLift. The other thing that we built that we released recently, just before GDC of this year, is something we call Matchmaking Cues. So we think of matchmaking as having two steps. The first step we would call match grouping, where a system would take the players that are currently playing the game and select a group of them to be put in a match. And that selection process is usually based on a set of criteria like skill or map or mode that the players want to play. There may be other criteria. That's match grouping. Match placing, the second phase, is once you have a group of people, where in the world do you create that game session? And that, again, is based on a set of criteria, typically latency. So where would you place that game that will provide the best player experience for the players in that match, given their latency between their clients and the game server? And latency is important because it affects the player experience of individual players. The lower the latency, the better player experience you'll have. But it also can affect competition. If one particular player has a better latency than the others, they can have an advantage. And so our matchmaking cues is a way that we intelligently select where to put a match to try to, once again, put the power in your hands to balance player experience with cost. And I'll explain how that works in a minute. So the way the system works is you would pass us, so using whatever matchmaking system you want to use, your own third-party matchmaking system, a platform, perhaps, matchmaking system, you would pass us a set of players and the latency values between those players, machines, and the different AWS regions that you want to place the game into. And then our system, the GameLift system, will, using that information and a set of other criteria, select which region to spin up your game server for that particular match. We'll use the latency information, but we'll also use our auto-scaling rules to determine if there's availability in the region that might be the best place for latency, but not the best place for the player to be waiting, because we'd have to create a new instance. We'll also factor in data center health. So if something is happening in that data center to cause it to be not as healthy as it should be, we might select a different region. Amazon GameLift currently supports 9 AWS data centers around the world, and we plan to add additional ones this year. So obviously these are the 9. Okay, so integrating the GameLift client API into your service. So as I talked about earlier, there's the GameLift server API, and you integrate that into your game server. The GameLift client API, which is the API that you ask us to create a game session, you ask us to place a game match. That API actually exists within the AWS SDK. So we don't have a separate client SDK. It's actually just a set of APIs that are within the AWS SDK. So you would integrate that into your game client or your backend service, matchmaking service, player authentication service. As many of you might know, the AWS SDK supports many languages, including C++ and Java and many others. So a lot of flexibility there in what language you use for the system that integrates that SDK. And once again, we have pre-built support for using the GameLift client API in Lumberyard. Okay, so I wanted to really briefly talk about how game session queues work. This is the matchmaking placement functionality in GameLift. You can create as many queues as you wish. Every queue gets a list of fleets or regions that are associated with the queue. And so those are the regions that we will consider to place a match into. Each time your matchmaking service wants to create a match with a specific set of players, what you're going to do is you're going to make a game session placement request of GameLift, and you're going to pass us that player information, and you're going to pass us the latency information as well. And what the queue is going to do is it's going to add that request to the list and try to place those players in a particular AWS region based on those criteria that I was talking about earlier. So when it finds the best fleet to place the match into, it will create an instance of your game server, and then it'll pass that information back to the matchmaking service or whatever service called us. Also at that time, GameLift's auto-scaling rules will apply, and so if we need to scale up the number of instances in a particular region to have the best player experience for your players, you have control over that. So you can use average player wait time and the depth or length of the queue as metrics to scale up and down the number of server instances in a particular region. So again, these two systems interplay. Auto-scaling and game session queues work together to allow you to provide the balance between player experience, player wait time, and cost that you want to have for your game and your player base. Once the game server has been created, we return back the server IP address and port number, and that gets passed to the game clients. And so once the game server exists, the game clients and the game server talk directly to each other. GameLift is not involved at that point, and so you have the lowest possible latency between your game client and your game servers, which is what I'm saying here. And so we add no additional latency once the game clients and the game servers are connected together. And for many games, that's really important, that we not introduce additional slowdown during gameplay after the game client and the game server are connected. Okay, so I talked about what today we think of as the two biggest value propositions of GameLift. One of the other things that we think is really important, and in some ways goes without saying, is Amazon GameLift is built on AWS. And so we get all the benefits of being an AWS service while being specifically tailored to be used within games. So we get DDoS protection that all AWS services get, which is very beneficial for gaming. We run on the reliable infrastructure that, of course, AWS has. And we have a selection of instance types that game developers can choose to use depending on the memory and processing requirements of your game server. A lot of words on this slide, but the high level is we've been very lucky to have a number of game developers using Amazon GameLift to this point and willing to speak publicly about their experience. On here we have the technical director for Gearbox, the developer that did Borderlands. We have CEO of Proletariat, which was one of our very first launch games. And BR Choi of AN Interactive has also talked about his usage of Amazon GameLift in things that he's been working on. So again, we're very proud of this customer testimonials, and we continue to work hard, right, to try to hold up our reputation with them. And there are a number of live games. So I mentioned Streamline. Streamline is a game that is shipped today using Amazon GameLift. Our internal games, including Breakaway, use them as well. So one of the benefits of having our own internal games is GameLift gets to leverage their usage of our service to work out issues and bugs early before we necessarily expose them outside of the company. And so it's a great testing bed for us, a way for us to make sure we do things right before we expose them externally. Okay, so that's Amazon GameLift today. and at a very high level, the functionality of Amazon GameLift. But of course, we think about what could we be doing in the future? Where could we take the service? There's a lot of things that we think about. So many things on this slide. The parts that are in the dark orange are the things that we do today. We do game session management, auto-scaling, server hosting. We do that second part of matchmaking, the placing of the matches. We're actively thinking about which of these other additional features we would want to add to Amazon GameLift. We will most likely start with what we have and grow it outwards. One of the things that is top of mind for us is doing that first half of matchmaking that I talked about, being able to provide a service as part of Amazon GameLift that allows you to specify the criteria for actually creating a match, and then using our service to build that match and put it together, and not have to have you write that yourself or have to use any other system that you might not want to use. And so that's something we're actively thinking about. Other natural things for us to add to Amazon GameLift that builds upon what we already have today, skill and rank, so being able to calculate the skill of a player after they played a match, and then storing that information somewhere for the game to access at a later date. Parties are another one. There's a natural extension of a matchmaking system. And so we're going to continue to grow GameLift. We're going to continue to add more functionality, all for the purpose of trying to build a dependable service for game developers so that they can focus on making great player experiences and building a great business, and not having to spend the time or the money or really the focus on these back-end systems that really should just work, right? And they should just be services that you can make the experience you want upon them, and we take care of making sure they're running, making sure that they're resilient, making sure they're providing the functionality you need. And I guess I'm going to close with just a note, which is, like many AWS services, Amazon GameLift has a free tier, meaning you can try Amazon GameLift at no cost. And if you're interested in Amazon GameLift, if you're building a game that uses dedicated servers, or if you're building a game that you were thinking of providing peer-to-peer networking, but have thought about dedicated servers might be a better experience for your customers, but it would be expensive because you need to incur the cost in that case, try Amazon GameLift and just see whether it can help you provide that great player experience at a cost-effective amount to you and your companies. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to my colleagues here in Korea, and we'll help you out with whatever information you need. And really, that's it for me. I appreciate your time, and thank you for attending the talk. And I think I can try to take questions, although I don't know how that'll work exactly. But but if you have questions, I certainly can try to answer them. And we're done.